Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. Today I want to discuss the Secure Shell file system, otherwise known as SSHFS. And there are several files-based share systems that are in use today. One of the most common is CIFS, or Common Internet File System, which is Microsoft's file shares. It used to be referred to as SMB, or Server Message Block. And then we have Linux's Network File Shares, or NFS, Network File System, I should say. And then we have Apple File Sharing, which is AFS. And finally, the discussion of today's presentation is SSHFS. So the openssh-server can support SSH, SFTP, and SSHFS. And so the SSH file transfer protocol, otherwise known as SFTP, works similarly to SCP, or Secure Copy. And SSHFS, the Secure Shell file system, uses SFTP under the hood, and it mounts a remote directory as if it were local, just like you can do with CIFS or NFS. And so SSHFS has the advantage over CIFS or NFS in that it is also encrypted. And so SSHFS uses only port 22 and does not require root privilege like NFS. And so what are the advantages of SSHFS? Well, it uses the SSH protocol over port 22, as I mentioned earlier. SSHFS can work over a WAN, over a VPN, or over a NAT connection. And the only server-side requirement is openssh-server, as we're going to see in the demonstration. And so SSHFS can run as a regular user and does not require root privilege. And so SSHFS uses file system in user space, otherwise known as Fuse, which is why it does not require any type of special privileges. And SSHFS is secure first, and it's not fast like NFS, which does not prioritize security. So let's go take a look at SSHFS. In past videos, I've used Secure File Transfer Protocol, otherwise known as SFTP, to be able to move files simply over to Incus containers or to Linux servers in general. So here I have two Linux containers. One is named test1, the other is named test2. So the prerequisite that we're going to need in order to use SFTP or SSHFS, which is really the subject of this video, is openssh-server. So we're going to do a sudo apt install openssh-server, and I'll do a net-tools just so I can list out my address easily, and a -y to go ahead and install those without prompting for me. I go ahead and put in my sudo password, and it installs those two products. Just as a bit of a review here, I'm going to go ahead and do an IP space A, or actually I can do an if config there because we installed net-tools. And we can see the address of our test2 container is 172.16.2.35. If I do an SSH-copy-ID over to Scott at 172.16.2.35, it'll prompt me for accepting the fingerprint. I go ahead and do a yes, and then it prompts me for the password. What that's done is it's copied a key over to that new server. So I can really go here and just say SSH over to Scott at 172.16.2.35, and it will log me in. And so one of the advantages of having an SSH key over there is the fact that I can bring up my file manager and I can simply access SFTP://172.16.2.35, and it will go ahead and access that system directly. I go into the home folder, and I can go into the Scott folder, and I can go ahead and create a new folder if I want, and I'll just go ahead and call this folder on test2, test2. And then I can create other files at the same time. But just to see, I can drag and drop anything that I want into this file manager, and that's why I've covered it before in previous tutorials, because it's one easy way to be able to place files on remote servers or remote Incus containers. Secure Shell File System, also called SSHFS, is a little bit different than the SSH File Transfer Protocol that we're using here. So I'm going to go ahead and dismiss this, and I'm going to go ahead and exit this terminal that is signed on to test2 by simply doing an exit, and I'll go ahead and do another exit. Underneath it, I have a terminal for test 1. So just as a little bit of a review, we installed openssh-server over on test 2, and that's all we need in order to be able to access a secure shell file system on a remote system. That is, openssh server is the sole prerequisite. If we go over to my test 1 server here, we're going to install some different components. And what we're going to install is SSHFS. We're also going to install openssh-server just because I usually want to do that. We don't really need openssh-server. We really need SSH, but since SSH client is a part of openssh-server, I'll just go ahead and install it. And finally, this is usually installed, but I'm going to install Fuse 3. And Fuse 3 is required for the file mounting of our SSHFS volumes. And so it's set up there that Fuse 3 was already at its latest version, because that is a standard part of the install, but I wanted you to know that we were installing it or that it was a requirement. Now that we have our dependencies installed on test 1, I want you to see that we don't have any files yet on the test 1 folder. But we're going to go ahead and create a folder called remote. So this remote folder will be the mount point for our SSHFS volume that we'll be mounting on test 2. An SSHFS mount is very easy to do. All we have to say is SSHFS. I'm using Scott, and it will be at the address of test 2, which is 172.16.2.35. We have a colon here, and we are going to be accessing the file system /home/Scott on the remote node, and we're going to use this remote folder right here to mount our file system. So all we do is hit enter, and it will ask us whether or not we want to acknowledge the signature, which of course we do. It will prompt us for the remote password. I can type in the remote password, and now if I do an ls, I still have remote. But if I cd into remote and I do an ls, we have in here test 2, which you'll recall I created earlier. We can also do a touch on scott.txt, which will create a scott.txt file here at the same level as the test2 folder. And now when I go over to test2 and do an ls, there we have scott.txt as well as test2. In order to dismount our folder, we cannot be inside of it, so I'm doing a cd to move back to the root level or the home folder of the Scott account. And next, I'm going to go ahead and do an fusermount-u and specify that remote folder. Another way to dismount that SSHFS folder is the very simple umount command, where we do a umount and we specify remote. Of course, it says it's not mounted because the fusermount-u dismounted it just previously. There's a way to perform this mount without providing a password, and in order to do so, we have to exchange our SSH keys. Before we can do that, we have to create a public and private key with an SSH-keygen-t ED25519, which is a common encryption, and then I just go ahead and hit enter, and it goes ahead and brings that up over here. And then at that point, I can copy my key over to the remote system. So let's copy our public key over to the test2 server with an SSH-copy-ID, username Scott at 172.16.2.35, which, as you'll recall, is the address of the test2 server. So we come back over here, we hit enter, and it will prompt us for our password over on test2 for the Scott account. I enter that, and now we have the key shared with the test2 remote server. Now that we have our SSH public key copied from test1 over to test2, it's going to be very simple to mount our SSH folder. And all we do to do that is an SSHFS-O, and the identity file is in .sh/id_ed25519, which we created up here in this command, and then we simply provide it the username, which is Scott, at the address of the system over there, and we're going to be mounting the home/Scott folder into the local folder named remote. When I hit enter now, it simply connects to that system, and it is that drive mounted. So all I have to do is do a cd back into remote. I can do an ls, and there the files are. Of course, I can create new files from either side, so I could go over to test2 and do a makedir on 123, and now we have a folder named 123 over on test2. If I come back here to test1 and do an ls, there is the test2 folder, the scott.txt file, and the 123 folder that we just created, except that we created it from the test2 side. And finally, if I want to dismount my folder, I can do a umount on the remote folder, but we're going to get an error here because we're currently inside of the folder, or inside of the mount point, I should say, and you can't dismount something while being inside of the mount point. The error that we get is that the target is busy. If I go ahead and cd back up to the home folder for the Scott account, and then I do the umount of the remote folder, it will successfully dismount. If I cd back inside of that remote folder and I do an ls, it of course is empty because it is no longer mounting the remote data. So in summary, SSHFS is great for having a quick and easy solution to remotely mount data on another server. And SSHFS is highly secure, but does not provide the performance that you can get from NFS. And SSHFS is not ideal for things like databases, virtual machine storage, or basically any heavy I/O use case. I have used SFTP many times on the channel before, and I like to use SFTP from my file manager in Linux in order to perform drag and drop operations to move files between servers. But it's only a file transfer protocol. And so SSHFS is an actual file system that allows the ability to mount storage located remotely. And so both SFTP and SSHFS use SSH, but they solve different problems. Anyway, that's it for today. Please subscribe and like to the channel, and don't forget to hit your notification bell, and we'll see you next time.